Welcome to Bears on Tap, hosted by Quentin Q. Crisco, Sonny Verma, and the one and only Ron Luce, bringing you all the news, analysis, and opinions on the charter franchise, Chicago Bears.
And we are back with another episode of Bears on Tap. My name is Quentin Crisco. As always, I'm joined by Mr. Ron Luce and Sonny Verma. But tonight, we have a very special guest for you guys, and Brandon Thorn coming here to talk some offensive line with us. Brandon, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing good, guys. Excited to do this. I appreciate your guys' attention and just appreciation for line play. So it's cool to join you.
Yeah, we watch a lot of your work, a lot of your content, and we try to emulate it in certain ways with our O-line episodes. And
I mean, there's a lot of Bears podcasts out there, but between Ron and Q, I feel comfortable saying that this is the unofficial offensive line podcast. So when it comes to the Chicago Bears during the season,
I love that. Well, hey, I guess I'm in the right place then. So.
Yeah, we try to put the work in on it, but
yeah, it's awesome.
I think the best thing to do here is just jump in with some of these questions that we have for you. And starting off, I mean, so the Bears, obviously, we got Drew Dahlman this offseason, and for years now, center has been such a glaring hole on our roster.
Yep.
Why? But it seems kind of like there's not a lot of middle ground in the NFL for center. You're either one of the top 5 guys, or from what I've seen, you end up in a pool of just like the other guys. Is there any reason you think that is in the NFL, or why it might be a less focused on position?
It's kind of interesting you say that. That's not what I would typically think of with center. I think it's just partly, maybe your idea of centers is a little skewed being a Chicago guy. Just because I feel like when I look at it league-wide personally, I feel like center's after left tackle, the deepest position in the league. On the offensive line, at least. I just think that there's like close to 15 centers that I would take, and I feel like would be like net assets for you, maybe a couple more, honestly, depending on how some of these young guys do this year. So I just don't know that Chicago has necessarily had one of those guys that I could think of, in recent memory. So, but yeah, I mean, I just feel like center in general is could be in some crowds, audiences, whatever, rooms, some people view it as the most important position. I've had some interesting conversations over the years at offensive line masterminds where, more than one offensive line coach or just coach in general has told me that they view center as the most important position on the line. And I mean, I think that's kind of easy to understand from a coaching perspective because they're essentially another coach on the field in a lot of respects. So when you have a guy at center as an offensive line coach, specifically, you feel a little bit more confident, that guys are going to be in the right spots and you're going to get into the right calls and you're going to identify the fronts, correctly and quickly and all that sort of stuff. So I think when you have a center, that is able to do that consistently, that could really elevate the whole unit, the whole offense, really make the quarterback more comfortable, so on and so forth. So it's just yeah, I mean, center has a lot of, I think, hidden underrated value, I think.
And Brandon, can you kind of highlight some of that maybe for the casual football fan? Because I myself am in coaching with offensive linemen, so I completely agree with that sentiment. I do think center is the most important position on the O-line, excuse me.
Yeah.
Can you just kind of highlight, especially for the casual football fan at home, of what are some of the center's potential, because obviously it varies team to team, but some of the potential responsibilities that a center might have to have in pre-snap and some of those different things?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, I think basic level, when you come out of the huddle and you're viewing the defense, you're trying to identify the front first and foremost to determine, if you're passing, what protection you're going to get in, or if you're running, trying to find the Mike linebacker, and that's going to dictate where you're comboing to, who you're not comboing to. So it's going to affect your double teams, your combo blocks, things like that, which, essentially every run concept has some variation of, if there's one or two or whatever. So yeah, it sets the center kind of sets the table, sets the tone for any given play based on if they can identify the defense correctly and then also quickly. And then there's layers to that, of course. If you have a super high level center, like I've talked to Olin Kreutz before a lot, he was at Masterminds this year again, and centers like that. When you're talking at elite level, Kevin Mawar was at the Masterminds. He was incredible this year. But I've been around a lot of like really high level centers: Creed Humphrey, Ryan Jensen, Eric McCoy, and I think when you're talking about that level, then you start to get into things like coverages and safety rotations and even like their placement on the hash marks and real detail oriented type stuff that you typically need a lot of experience to get to that level. You need to master the fronts, master the linebackers, master kind of the front seven, and then you could kind of get into the next PhD level center play. So I think that's a huge part of it. You're quarterbacking the line, so mental processing is a big piece of it. And then also I think confidence is something that was really emphasized to me a couple of years ago by Steve Hutchinson. Actually, he said that he feels like the most important trait for center is confidence, and like a certain kind of swagger about them, a self-assuredness, borderline cockiness. He even said isn't a bad thing if he's sitting down at the combine interviewing a center. Like he wants to feel like they're extremely confident in themselves, because you kind of need to be to tell four other offensive linemen what to do, what not to do. And that sort of thing. And typically the center is, if not the leader of the offensive line room in the NFL, they're certainly one of the two leaders, maybe 1B. So yeah, center's there's a lot of intangibles, I think, with center, aside from the physical traits. And then if you could get the physical traits, then you got a guy like Ryan Jensen, who was, kind of a rare guy, in terms of his ability to like physically impose his will on guys. Typically, used to guards and tackles do that. But there's some centers that can do that as well. But that's almost like a bonus. You want the intangible, I feel like, first.
Definitely. Is there any reason you think there's kind of a lack of the guys like Ryan Jensen, I guess, who can do both, like you're saying? Yeah.
I just think those body types, Jensen was 6'4", 320, 330. There's just not a lot of centers like that. I think those body types typically get snatched up at guard first. That's just kind of the prioritization of it. Typically, I think it's almost like it goes upstream, from lower levels. Like, you coach, so like typically the biggest, most talented guys playing tackle, and then the next most talented guys probably playing guard, and then like centers, like this tough, scrappy kid. That's kind of the norm, the cliche. But sometimes the center winds up being a guy who's one of the better athletes, and I wouldn't say that's necessarily the norm, although, like I said, I think center is very deep in the NFL, and there's some more of those guys kind of trickling in. Creed Humphrey's obviously, I think he's the best center in the league, and that's partly why he's the best center in the league. He could do all the stuff we talked about intangible wise. I remember talking to his offensive line coach, Bill Badenbaugh, at Oklahoma, and he told me pretty much the first week he was on campus, Creed Humphrey was the leader of the room. He knew the whole offense within a couple weeks. He was making all the calls, and sometimes you got a guy like that, and then, oh, by the way, he goes to the combine and he's one of the best athletes of all time. And, he's also a superstar wrestler. So it's just like, sometimes you get guys like that, but there's other guys like that too in the NFL now. Graham Barton to me is kind of next in line in a lot of respects. Zach Frazier's kind of like that, where they're big and strong enough to like impose their will on guys, and they're also athletic, and they also are super smart. So, there's guys like that. I think Ryan Kelly was like that, especially in his prime. Isn't necessarily a now. So there's guys like that. But yeah, generally speaking, I think you kind of work outside in for athletes, and that's kind of the way it goes.
Definitely. And I love all the center love, because I once upon a time played center myself.
I love center. It's my favorite position to watch.
It's a fun position. But speaking of Creed Humphrey, a guy who played a lot of football to his left in Kansas City, Joe Thuney, the new addition to the Chicago Bears offensive line this year.
Yeah, love Thuney.
How much can a talent like Joe Thuney elevate an entire offensive line room?
I mean, we're about to find out. I think we kind of found that out a little bit in KC. He was the leader of the line there, pretty much his whole time. So, yeah, you just look what they did there. Obviously, they hit, on Trey Smith and, built, hit on Creed. That was kind of an all-time draft offensive line-wise. Trey was kind of a unique thing. So that all worked out. But Thuney was definitely the leader of the line. So I think that he is instantly the leader of the line in Chicago. Dahlman in some respects too, but just, skins on the wall. Thuney is kind of unmatched. What has he been to 6 Super Bowls and 4 rings and all pros and every accolade you could ever want. And I truly think last year he was the best left guard in the NFL. He kicked out to left tackle and of course was okay there, but like his left guard tape last year was phenomenal. But I've been a huge fan of him since New England, and I think the main reason for that is just how technically sound he is. He's not the biggest guy. He's not kind of impose his will necessarily on a lot of guys, but he's going to cover guys up. He's going to stay attached. He's going to re-leverage on blocks exceptionally well, stay underneath guys. He's just ruthlessly consistent in his technique, footwork, hands, leverage. Just checks all the boxes there. So I think having a guy like that in the room is extremely beneficial, for a young room that you just revamped, because he's not maybe adding somebody who's just physically gifted like a Tyler Smith. Not that he's not nuanced and all this stuff, but it's a little bit harder to kind of pick up cues from guys who are just physically incredibly gifted. It's a little bit more natural to them. Thuney is a guy where you might see Thuney and you're like, oh, okay, not super impressive. And but he has so much, I would imagine, wisdom and just knowledge to share with guys because of how he plays and how precise he is. So, yeah, I mean, it's up to the guys in the room, obviously the young guys, to follow him around and pick his brain and all that sort of stuff. So they have to do their part. But I feel like Thuney's a wealth of knowledge, and I mean, he's played a lot of football at the highest level. So I totally understand why you would add a guy like Thuney and covet him highly. I mean, I would as well.
Yeah, I just watched recently, since the last month, a couple games of Thuney, and a lot of what you said was the things that popped in my mind, right? It was man, this guy is so clean with his hands. He has so many different sets that he's attacking defenders with, and the way that he's not showing them the same thing twice. And it was almost like he had a sixth sense for stunts coming, right, and knowing where they are. And I just couldn't help but think man, if he can work with Darnell Wright on some of this stuff, I'd be real excited about that, because I think Wright has some of that more God-given talent that you see.
Yep. Yeah, that would be, I mean, even though they're on the opposite side, you can obviously pick the brain of any, a guard, just the guard tackle relationship still translates in many respects there. So yeah, even, Braxton Jones, Ozzie Trapillo, I mean, playing next to a guy like Joe Thuney, whether you're center, tackle, or a young guard who's trying to learn, I mean, there's wealth of knowledge to go around in a lot of different directions depending on what you're seeking. And yeah, so can't say enough good things about Thuney. I thought, I had him as the best left guard coming into the year this season as well. Definitely in tier 1, if nothing else. And, 32 years old this season, I still think, there's probably a really good chance we'll have at least 1, maybe 2 more years of what we saw last year in him. So, yeah, knock on wood.
Brendan, quick question. So you've kind of alluded to this before. The game of football is constantly changing. People are trying to find different ways to win. For the smart guys in the room, like yourself, the guys are always 2 steps ahead. Would you say that in today's NFL, overall, the tackles are still the king? Or would you say the interior right now has pretty much gained ground when it comes to overall importance on the line?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think ultimately, I mean, guards and centers, the interior of the pocket, more teams have kind of built that way, especially the teams getting in, a lot of spotlight. So it's got more recognition, like the Chiefs are the predominant example, who, you know, they've leaned on their interior and they kind of built inside out on their offensive line, even though they spent a ton of money on Jawan Taylor. That didn't necessarily come to fruition like I'm sure they hoped. He's fine, but, you know, maybe a little overpaid there. But nonetheless, like their offensive line is, you know, built that way. You know, kind of the big example that I grew up, you know, scouting, you know, was the Saints, you know, with Carl Nix and Jonathan Goodwin and Jahari Evans, you know, with Aaron Cromer as the offensive line coach. You know, so like there's been some high profile teams that have built that way. And now that we have another one, and then you could even maybe like put somebody in some, I mean, Philly's not the best example because they have studs everywhere, but like Landon Dickerson, Brandon Brooks, Mekhi Becton, these big giant guards with an Hall of Fame center like we saw for so long, even though they also had great tackles. They were another team that had a great interior three. I mean, I think Dallas the last couple of years with Tyler Smith and Zach Martin was probably the best guard duo for a short time there. You know, and they had Biadish 1 year and then Cooper Beebe last year. So like there's teams that we've seen that are kind of high profile that have built that way, had some success, at least as an offensive line, if not a team. So, you know, has it evened out with tackles? I still think tackles is the premium just because they're harder to find. You know, just because of the space that they play in, the athletic ability that is required to play in said space, while also being a 6'4", 6'5" plus 300 plus human being. It's just more rare. So tackle is still the premium. However, you can build an elite level offensive line by not having great tackles necessarily and having really good interior players and more teams. If I think of the proof of concept has expanded essentially in that, you know, line of thinking. So I think you could do it either way. It just kind of depends. And then I also think quarterback plays a part of this as well. Of course, your coaching staff, your scheme, how well you can scheme around holes in pass protection is huge. You guys have a great coach who does that at the highest level in Ben Johnson. But yeah, so when you have a coach like that, you could be even more flexible. You could just let talent fall to you where it may in the draft and free agency, and then just build based on what's in front of you. So that always helps as well, I think.
Now, Brandon, you mentioned Aaron Cromer in there, and I realized we didn't do this at the start of the show, so I think right now is a good time to transition to that. Where can people find your great work, like your interview that you had with Aaron Cromer just recently that was very informative?
Yeah, so trenchwarfare.substack.com. People can go there, check out my work, subscribe. Did an interview with Coach Cromer. I was very excited and thankful that he was willing to do that. I mean, I don't see NFL offensive line coaches be involved in the media very often, especially in like long form content like that. So for him to feel confident to do that with me was pretty special. And then I also did one with Bobby Johnson, who's the Commanders offensive line coach. So yeah, people can check out my work there. I have interviews with various players, and you know, those two coaches were some of the more recent ones.
It comes highly suggested with the Bears on tap stamp of approval. But getting back to our next question here, this one's more Bears specific, and we're talking about Braxton Jones, who's been a polarizing player in the Bears fan base. Health aside, he's been a pretty solid offensive tackle in my eyes, and tell me if you're seeing anything differently, but his anchor seems to be the Achilles heel with him, his ability to stop power once it gets into his chest or to prevent it from getting into his chest. Do you think that's something that can be improved upon over a player's career, or is it something that he's going to have to mitigate?
Yeah, it's a good question. When you say the anchor, I agree that has been an issue. I think it's due to a specific reason as well, and that's something that I honestly saw when he was coming out of Southern Utah, and I was concerned about in terms of capping his ceiling as a tackle, and that was his range in pass protection. I thought was well below average, and yeah, a lot of that comes down to foot quickness or lack thereof. Also, part of it is kind of a feel and technique thing as well. So what I mean by range is, if you could picture an offensive tackle taking a 45-degree pass set to meet the rusher, or to get to his spot and intersect the rusher. From that point forward, after he gets to his spot, depending on what the rusher does, let's say it's a high side rush, he's going outside. And if it's a skilled pass rusher, he's going to set up the move somehow to get the pass blocker's feet to stop. So you're out of your set, you get to your spot, your feet stop, and then he's going high side around the outside corner. That ability to expand from there, redirect from there, and kind of flow, out and expand essentially. That's your range. And I think Braxton Jones is just it's below average. So if guys are able to threaten him with speed, set up speed, threaten him with speed, whatever, he really has to overcompensate to get out there. And in doing so, his pads rise, he turns. And then if you have a rusher who's able to convert speed to power, that's where they blow him up in his anchor. That's typically what I've seen from him. Like straight bull rush down the middle from a big, powerful guy. Like I think Braxton Jones is really strong. And I think he can match that, pretty well. He is a taller player, so he does have leverage working against him, up and down leverage, that is. So that's kind of a chore for him. But I feel much more confident with him against a straight power guy. There's not a lot of those guys rushing over left tackles. Honestly, most of those guys are rushing over right. But there's powerful guys over the left tackle, and I feel better about that. But if you have a guy like Khalil Mack or something is kind of the peak of this, he has plenty of speed and all the quickness to threaten that. But you've seen Khalil Mack put guys on posters. Eric Fisher is one, where he threatens with speed, goes to power, hits the inside stab, lifts the inside shoulder, and just takes a guy off his feet. Like that sort of style of rusher, or if a rusher has that in his bag, which a lot of guys have it in their bag to certain degrees, that gives them a lot of trouble. And I don't know how correctable that is, to be honest. I think it's kind of a physical ability piece to a large degree, technique to a lesser degree. So yeah, you could make it a little bit better, I guess, but I think that's gonna be his Achilles heel, and it just kind of caps his ceiling. So that's how I've always seen him.
So, do you think there's a legitimate chance that Ozzie Trapillo might be able to beat him out for a spot, or is that too much in the weeds of what's happening in practice and hard to tell from the sidelines?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's feasible, honestly, for a couple different reasons. One, because I do think Braxton Jones's ceiling is clearly capped, even though his floor is, high enough to be functional. So that's one reason. Also, the accumulation of injuries, a little bit concerning. And then also this coaching staff has no ties to him whatsoever. So, that's always, something as a player, when a new staff comes in, you're kind of facing an uphill battle sometimes, especially if you're not already like an established star kind of guy. So, yeah, with all that being said, I certainly think Trapillo could beat him out. I mean, I don't think Trapillo was ever somebody I would have projected to play left tackle just because we never saw it at Boston College. I didn't. I don't think he played there. The tape I watch, he never did. And he's not necessarily the sort of player that you would say could move over there as easily. But on this offensive line, with all that said about Braxton Jones, it does make some sense to me that you would at least try it out, considering you have an established starter already at right tackle in Darnell Wright. So I kind of think of it as like, if anything, I think Trapillo could be at least as good as Braxton Jones, if not very, very close, where it's negligible, the differences. So if you have a younger guy that you brought in and you think that he can give you close to equal play and then maybe get better over time, yeah, I mean, it would make sense if he beat him out, I wouldn't be surprised.
Heck yeah. I know Q. This question burns from Q's depths, and I think to some extent myself as well, because as guys who like numbers, we're always looking for something to quantify or be a qualitative metric, and quite frankly, there really isn't necessarily one on the offensive line. So,
yeah.
What metric do you think would best exemplify offensive line play, if there is one? And if one didn't exist, what would you like to see maybe tracked or analyzed that could create some kind of metric to help you know, more easily maybe rank or kind of grade an offensive lineman based on their play?
Yeah, I mean it's a really good question. I think you have to separate it from unit and player. There's some unit stuff. I remember Football Outsiders, which is now it's a different company, Aaron Schatz's company. I know it's not footballoutsiders.com anymore, but like
FTN Fantasy.
yeah. So yeah, I really like Aaron's work. But like adjusted line yards, was always one that was just like for run game, kind of point you in the general right direction of like, team units that ranked highly in that. You can probably see quality run blocking there. So it's a good place to kind of start if you wanted to see that. That was always one to me years ago that I, would peek at. Other unit rankings, I mean, I feel like you just kind of have to do it the way I do it, where you're studying the film of all 32 units as best you can. Try to learn about the coaches, their track record of development, factor in quarterback play, learn about the players on and off the field as best you can, and just try to get into the weeds as much as you can and try to rank from there. I mean, I just haven't seen another great unit metric out there that I really look at. I've never really been one to look at numbers for offensive line. Since I've started doing true sack rate, true pressure rate, I've looked at more numbers because that's kind of the basis of my pass rusher metrics. I look at PFFs or True Media, which uses PFF data. I look at their pressures. But that's kind of opened my eyes to the fact that, I don't want to pretend like I, know everything or anything like that, but because I don't. But there's a lot of pressures, man. When I watch charted pressures for offensive linemen, that like I really struggle, to see how they got charted as pressures. Landon Dickerson is a good example from last year. There's a handful of his pressures that are charted as pressures to where I just think, I mean, like hands down, it's on Jalen Hurts. Like that's not on Landon at all. So, it gets tricky when you're talking about players. I think you could look at the PFF data if you have access to that and look at the pressures of a guy and watch the clips of them, and that could kind of give you an idea of how a guy is doing. But I think if you have a relative trained eye, you could see through some of the noise there, because I do think there is still noise in that. When you're looking at pressures in particular, sacks are kind of, it is what it is. However, most sacks are on quarterbacks, so can't even really look at that. So that's why I say pressures. And I haven't really looked at run blocking grades much. I mean, I feel pretty good about being able to assess that. But yeah, I mean, not maybe a great answer, maybe a couple little breadcrumbs there for people, but yeah, that's kind of how I feel. And then also, I'm actually in kind of behind the scenes talks of doing some offensive line grading stuff potentially, maybe in the next year or so. So just want, yeah, that's out there, and that could be huge. So
I think that further exemplifies though why like what you do is so important, because offensive line is such a position where there's so many different things that go into a grade, or even something like you said, as simple as a pressure, that people will be like, oh yeah, pressures, that makes sense. And it's like, but the context of those pressures, right? It's probably the one position in the field where you can't just look at a box score or look at something and be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. These guys are great. It's like, no, that's not.
It's gotten better, since 10 years ago when I started and PFF was doing stuff. But there's still, I think, quite a bit of room for improvement.
Definitely.
So with that, like, how do you think the new offensive line award that is entering the NFL this year, how do you feel about the voting that's coming in on that? And I'm not sure the details of how who is voting, where that's coming from, but without the ability to have much stats behind it, how do you keep that from becoming just a PFF backed award?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, you would hope that the panel is just going to be watching the tape a lot. And I know that for a fact, a couple of them will be at least, and maybe all of them will. I don't know that that's not the case, but I am a little skeptical that guys have been retired for multiple years are going to be, grinding tape 30 hours a week, maybe, but I mean, it takes at least 30, 40 hours to watch all the tape for me. I mean, it's my full-time job. I have the benefit of doing that, but like, I start Monday morning and I finish Thursday night, usually just watching tape. And then I have to do college, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So in order to do that award justice, I think you have to watch the film. And, you could look at the criteria on the NFL. Troy Vincent came out and there's links on Twitter. You can find them or whatever. And NFL.com, I think, has them. They have a criteria. I like some of it, like the leadership part and, because the panel is a 6-person panel, I believe. They're all-time great offensive linemen, essentially. And they have tackles, guards, and centers there, multiple Hall of Famers, Andrew Whitworth, Jason Kelsey, Will Shields, Orlando Pace, Charles Bentley, Sean O'Hara. I think that's everybody. Yeah, so those are the guys that are going to be grading. So like they'll be able to kind of assess, probably leadership and kind of the hard to measure intangible type stuff. Durability is going to be part of it, which I think is important for offensive line play. Playing hurt is, and it's essential. So that's part of it. And then they're going to be looking at, I don't remember off the top of my head, but some sort of metrics, and they don't identify where they're getting those metrics. So, chances are PFF's going to play a part in it, which is fine. I mean, as long as it's just a small piece of the puzzle. Yeah. So because it's the first year and we just don't know, it's hard to say what we don't know, but, tinges of optimism, tinges of skepticism there for me. So we'll see. I'm glad they have it. So
Yeah, no, I think it's a great thing to have, even if the process is still getting figured out. But I have a quick question. Just this is probably more for my benefit than anything. But when you sit down on a Monday or Tuesday after the games are over, and you're saying like, okay, I got to go watch these guys because these guys are, newer to me. Maybe obviously, every week you're like, I can't wait to watch Lane Johnson, right? Because he's Lane Johnson.
Yep.
But how do you find the other guys who might not be as heralded that you're like, I need to watch these guys as soon as possible?
Well, I mean, after the amount of time that I've been watching it now, going on 10 years, I think it's my 10th season of like really just watching offensive line play. I pretty much know who those guys are now, rookie wise, like, and then of course there's second, third year guys that just develop out of nowhere that I don't see coming or nobody does. So, you typically see those guys, when you're just watching film, stuff pops. But for the most part, like I'm going to watch, everybody that like makes an all-pro team or a Pro Bowl or was in consideration for those things. I'm watching those guys for sure. But I'm watching every game every week. And typically there's at least one guy on every offensive line that I'm watching. So, there's some games where I'm just watching one player on the line and, I've probably have watched everybody on the line already to some degree. So, I've been scouting for Bleacher Report for the last 5 years. So I've watched every single offensive lineman who's gotten drafted and wrote scouting reports on them the last 5 seasons. So all the guys who are 5 years or younger in the NFL, I know really well. And then a lot of veterans I know well just watching them and stuff, being around them. So I have a pretty good idea. But yeah, I mean, when I sit down on Monday morning, I'm watching Trent, I'm watching Lane, like first, order of importance here. I'm watching the guys that get me excited. And then, when you're watching Trent Williams, Dominic Puni will pop. Or, you're going to see something from somebody you don't expect. Aaron Banks will have, some nice blocks here and there. Or, watching Lane. I mean, the Eagles take a long time to watch because I love watching. Landon's like one of my favorite players. He's the maybe the most dominant college offensive lineman I've ever seen. Certainly him and Panay are up there. Landon was insane, but I love Landon Dickerson. So I'm watching Landon. I'm watching Lane. Of course, I'm going to look at Mailata because him and Landon are killing people. So I got to replay the same play 5 times sometimes with Philly, 6, 7, 8 times sometimes. So like some units are like that, but then some units, like the lesser ones that aren't just very good, I'm going to watch their best player and then, just kind of keep tabs on anything else that I see and just try and get through it.
Well, let's hope you're watching a little more of the Bears this year.
I will be watching the Bears more than I can ever remember watching. So,
watching as much film as you do, I guess my question for you is like, when you talk about the established players, not so much, but maybe the newer players. Like, what are maybe more specifically the type of traits you're looking for? You know, maybe one or two when you're watching and evaluating the different positions, you know, the tackle, guards, and center. What are you looking for that kind of jumps out at you?
Yeah, I mean, run game, I would say the strength at the point of attack is kind of where you start a lot of the time, at least when contact starts. Like, you want to see how they handle contact in the run game, and even in pass protection as well. If they're anchoring, you just want to see, are they conceding any ground? What does their pad level look like? Where are their hands placed? Because pad level, up and down leverage, hands, left and right leverage, and then there's body positional leverage in terms of your alignment on the defender relative to the ball. So, like, those three sorts of leverages, and then how that kind of transpires into your play strength and your ability to hold the point, reset the line of scrimmage, and then get into the second and third phase of the run block in terms of creating movement, finishing. You kind of go piece by piece, and you just kind of see how that goes together. And then you have to watch the defensive linemen that they're going against as well and have an idea of them. So I watch a lot of defensive line guys as well. So that can, based on who they do that against and how good or not good they look, then you also have to look at who they're doing against, because then that's going to further, contextualize things and give you an idea of, like, how impressive is this really? Because even though it is the NFL, there are levels to it as well. So that's another big piece of it, is looking at who they're playing. I think that's one of PFF's biggest blind spots, is they don't factor in level of competition. That's a massive blind spot in my opinion. So that's a big part of it. Like pass protection, more so for inside guys, like play strength, anchor, is very important, which is kind of a byproduct of all those leverages I talked about. Also, of course, initial quickness, like how quickly are you getting to your spots, your landmarks, your aiming points. That's critical. Pass protection, I think tackles, like what I talked about, the range, that's a huge thing I always look at for tackles, especially college guys. Like, if they have enough range to protect the corner on an island, that's huge. So how they get out of their stance, how quickly they get to their spot, and are they getting there quickly? Is it hurried, or is it, the whole slow, smooth is fast thing? Is that the way they're getting there? I always love the distinction between footwork and foot quickness. Some guys have quick feet. You watch them in the ladders, man, their feet are quick. But you put them on a football field and you put them in a game situation and you ask them to get to a spot, with good leverage and good timing, and they're getting nowhere quickly, essentially, because their footwork is kind of off. So there's a distinction there. Like, obviously you want both. You want guys with quick feet, but also there's guys like Mitchell Schwartz, like his feet were not quick. I mean, he was not athletic, poor athlete, elite tackle. Like, his footwork was great, his hands were great, his processing was great. He was smart, tough, all that kind of stuff. So, like, that's the beauty of offensive line play. You want the freaks of nature who can do it all, but man, you could get by if your technique is good and your footwork is good. So I always, I'm trying to identify guys like that on tape. I love finding guys like that. Typically, day 3 undrafted guys. That's why I love Jensen so much. Day 3 guy. So anytime a day 3 or undrafted guy is doing stuff on an NFL field, I'm gonna try to find you and shine a light on you, because that's awesome to me.
I feel like one of the guys I recall that was very much what you just said, like the pure technician. They're so silky smooth, but they're not the most heralded offensive lineman, was like a Willie Colon for the Steelers.
Oh, that's a good
Like
pull.
he was very much
he was
that
nasty
way.
too.
Yeah, he was.
Yeah,
And like
Mitch wasn't nasty, but
I
yeah,
remember coming up
that's
as a player, like Cologne was always a guy that we were shown, was like, he might not be like the most imposing guy. And
Donald Penn.
Yeah, Donald Penn's another great one. So it's
Donald
like
Penn.
it's like you said, it's fun finding those guys, because
I love it.
They don't jump off the paper necessarily with the Raz scores of the world and things like that. Because we've had Kent on the show here before too, and but you turn on the tape and you're so blown away by how those guys move.
I love it. There's so many different ways of doing it, and that's like one of my big takeaways from Offensive Line Mastermind since I've started there 8 years ago or whatever, is like that's what we preach all the time. There's so many different ways of doing it. So try to find a guy like you and then just try to add some stuff to your game that he does, because yeah, there's a lot of ways.
A lot of flavors of ice cream.
Oh yeah.
Now,
Absolutely.
I feel like that a lot of flavors of ice cream kind of comes to a question for me too, of like, sometimes in the O line there are just guys who they're not the most technically sound. They might not be the best athlete, but they just always find a way to get the job done and just bring some type of attitude. How do you value that in your evaluation of players, where it's like, this guy just seems to do the job?
I mean, that to me is like a Willie Colon kind of guy. Competitive toughness, finishing, going that kind of just that extra, to the echo of the whistle is kind of the best way to say it, I guess. There's guys that could get by with that as kind of their primary skill, but that's very rare. Like, oh man, I don't even know if there's a guy, and typically no tackle is going to get by that way. That's even more rare. Tackles do that, like Deion Dawkins is a great example, but he has a lot of stuff he's working with physically that's very gifted. But like centers, that's typically what you'll see, like Ben Jones, that's one that comes to mind. For the Titans, 4th round pick out of Georgia, not very talented, tough, but he also played with like really good leverage. I think like if you're going to be a tough, nasty guy who's going to finish guys and, border the dirty, kind of label, but never quite get there. Olin Kreutz is obviously, in that conversation. Ryan Jensen, you usually have to have something else. Olin Kreutz was very small, but he was one of the strongest guys you'll ever see ever in the weight room. There's freakishly strong. So he compensated for it. Ryan Jensen was a big center. And also very strong. So like typically you need something to pair with that competitive toughness. I think, whether it's technique or like a play strength, or, you're a quick processor, typically that's a very common one, tough and smart, that's usually, you could get by with that at center or guard. So there's some guys like that, I think, and those are always some of my favorite players to watch as well.
Okay. Now, so we're talking a little bit on the individual side here, but with O-line, like, we try to isolate these individuals, and the Bears have definitely added talent on the individual level. But a lot of O-line comes down to that team within the team and how they work together, how they work as a team. How long do you think it takes for an offensive line like this, where it's a bunch of new faces who have never played together before, aside from maybe the tackles, to truly gel?
Yeah, I mean, it's dependent on some other factors, such as, I think, what they're being asked to do, what they're not being asked to do, how offensive line friendly is the scheme. I think that is a big tell to determine how conducive that is to, building continuity and things like that. Just because, generally speaking, when you're in that sort of scheme, the level of difficulty is pretty low. In terms of what you're being asked, they're going to put you in a lot of good positions. They're not going to ask you to, true drop back pass and, that sort of thing very often, if they can help it, assuming you're not getting blown out or anything. So I think Ben Johnson is, you watch the Detroit Lions offensive line the last 3 years or whatever, 2.5, 3 years. That is one of the most offensive line friendly schemes you'll ever see. First of all, they're led by the run game. So that in of itself, just bare bones level, that is a plus. Okay. So the run game is emphasized and it's diverse, and there's a lot of window dressing on it. So you're going to, if, say your angle of departure as an offensive lineman and your snap timing isn't pristine, well, that motion headed the other way is going to buy you an extra second to get to your landmark to cut off the linebacker because of what the scheme did. And Ben Johnson's a master at that. Kyle Shanahan, Sean McVay, Matt LaFleur, all those guys. So that is a very friendly scheme. So if you're new and you're not totally dialed in with the guy next to you, the timing isn't just right, the feel isn't just right, your nonverbal communication isn't there yet because you haven't played. Well, if you have all these other things around you that are making things easier, buying you a half a second here, a half a second there, shielding you from having to drop back and pass the ball. And you're doing 100 different kinds of play action where, you have 2 tight ends attached to the line of scrimmage and they're going to block TJ Watt this play. The offensive lineman doesn't even need to block TJ Watt on this play, or whoever the pass rusher is, because we got it with ancillary players. But we're only going to do that twice a game for you. That's 2 less plays that I got to worry about. We're going to run 3 screens. We're going to do this and that, RPO, all this sort of stuff. And it adds up. And I think the Bears are in that sort of scheme. So I say that to say, I think that the Bears, assuming health is good and all that, are probably going to be able to gel together relatively quickly. I'd be surprised if they don't. I mean, unless Ben Johnson forgets how to coach, or unless Caleb is terrible or something, something has to go haywire for this not to at least be competent, in my opinion. So, but in terms of the how, that's the how. I think when you're new, I think a lot of it is dependent on that. And then, of course, the chemistry in the offensive line room and how well you get along with the guys. And typically offensive line rooms have really good camaraderie, so that's usually not an issue. But yeah, the tighter knit you are with the guys around you, the the quicker you are going to get closer and gain familiarity and rapport and all that sort of stuff.
It's all the buddies in the room, and there's no better position when it comes to stuff like that.
Yeah.
Speaking of the room, and especially specifically looking at the Chicago Bears, what are your thoughts on newly hired offensive line coach Dan Ruchar in terms of from like a scheme and player development perspective? Like, what are your kind of raw thoughts on his, pedigree and what he's going to be able to bring to the table for the Chicago Bears?
So what I primarily go off of when I think of him is his time in New Orleans, because I remember I posted a few things on him on Twitter, I think, just mentioning his name and how impressed I was with the Saints, because I think he was there 6-7 years or whatever, and those Saints offensive lines were the Saints have had a good offensive line for a long time, and Rauscher was the guy leading the room for 6 or 7 of those years. So I mean, the proof is in the pudding there. Guys developed. Guys played their best football in New Orleans during that period of time. Teron Armstead, Ryan Ramczyk. I mean, I think he was there maybe for Streif. Larry Warford, Max Unger, Eric McCoy, Andrews Pete, Cesar Ruiz is now, incrementally got better. I mean, they've had a lot of good players, under him there. So I think he has an impressive track record, probably pretty underrated. Considering what he did in New Orleans. And then from a schematic perspective, I think they were put in a lot of good positions to succeed, obviously, because they did. From what I remember, those run games, pretty diverse, though. You'd see duo, you'd see inside zone, you see pin pull, you see outside inside zone. I remember seeing a little bit of everything. They had the personnel to do it. Toss crack, of course, with Teron Armstead. You got to run toss crack when you have a dude at left tackle. That's kind of, you got to do that. So you saw that. They had just a lot of good players, and they put them in a lot of different positions to shine. So I think probably pretty adaptive to the personnel. And the more we talk about it, the more it makes sense that he's with Ben Johnson, who wants to run a very diverse scheme, have a little bit of everything in there, adapt to the personnel, that sort of thing. So, I haven't talked about Rauscher much, on podcasts and stuff, but I'm pretty excited about, what they've done to the offensive line personnel, coaching, scheme. Now they got to go out and do it, but I mean, I'm pretty optimistic.
Definitely helps when all the pieces are in place. Now you just got to go execute on that.
Yeah. Yep.
And you mentioned the diversity of the run scheme you saw from Rauscher and from Ben Johnson, and that, as a Bears fan, I end up thinking back to like Luke Getsy, who wanted to try to run a bunch of different run schemes or run concepts.
Yeah.
But never seemed to get it married up to the pass game. So can you touch on the importance of having those two married, and what might get in the way of teams being able to execute that?
Yeah, that's, man, putting an offense together is obviously highly complex. There's so many factors into it. Yeah, I mean, having an efficient run game, I think, is kind of where it starts, though, because it favorable down and distances is kind of what you're looking for. Manageable situations. You're trying to increase those. And I think an efficient run game is how you do that. You move the ball with the run game, you score touchdowns with the passing game, or at least you get explosive with the passing game. But in order to do that, you typically have to be in favorable situations where there's an element of surprise. You don't want to be in obvious passing situations. That's a death blow to the offensive line. When you break the huddle and you have to pass and the defense knows you have to pass, that's the worst situation to be in as an offensive lineman. So I think avoiding that as much as possible is critical. Having a diverse run game could be the way. You can also be McVay typically has been zone oriented, but there's so many different ways to do it. The beauty of McVay to me always has been making the same thing look different. That's what makes McVay great, I think. So there's ways to, have something that you really major in and lean into, like zone or gap or whatever, and making it work if you're creative enough, and you could coach the details well enough. So, but marrying it with the pass game, I think that's kind of where it starts. That's how I would answer that question. I think it becomes much easier if you're gaining 3 yards as opposed to 1 or none, or losing yards, and you're at least getting to 2nd and 7, and then that way, you keep the playbook open and you're not, pigeonholing yourself, because then if you do that, it doesn't really even matter what you're calling. Then it just becomes like, do we have a dude at quarterback who can right our wrongs and make somebody miss in the pocket, escape, and find a guy downfield on a scramble drill? And, so, yeah, it's a lot of different ways of going about it, but that's kind of how I would answer that question.
Interesting. I like that answer. That's very well said, I think. But the final question for me here, and it puts you on the spot a little because we didn't send you this one, but Ron had one when we were brainstorming all this of do you think Darnell Wright can continue to play as kind of much of a wild man as he has, or do you think that's something that's going to need to be tamed in under Roshar? And where do you think his ceiling kind of sits at this point?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think starting with what I thought of him coming out of Tennessee, I liked him a lot because I thought he had sort of those trump card traits, size, power, competitive toughness. He had all that in spades. And I thought if all else fails and he never, like you said, kind of reins it in and gets really technically sound, or at least more technically sound, at least you have a guy like that who he's going to anchor and he's going to move people. And like, I thought that was going to happen in the NFL when I evaluated him. So typically guys like that, I like, because the things that he needs to improve are technically coachable. And he has the unteachable things, enough athletic ability. He's not a great athlete. He's fine, I think. So that's sort of a, limiting factor to a degree. But yeah, I going back and watching his tape again for my top 75, I was pretty impressed, with some of the things that he was doing, especially considering just he was in a bad situation last year. The whole offensive line was, and, they contributed to some of it, of course, as well. But just with the quarterback play being a little erratic, and obviously the coaching stuff, the injuries, all that type of stuff. So with that said, I still thought you saw all the things that you would want to see from him in terms of, play strength being there in the run game. And then the anchor, I think, is definitely stout with him. There's times when he could be late with his hands, let guys into his chest, and that's just a technique thing. But I think, for the most part, he has a pretty good anchor. I'd say really good anchor. So I think what you want to see is him being put in better situations, that are more conducive to success. And I think, based on everything we've talked about right now, I think he is the guy. Obviously, there's 3 new guys, so it's only him and Braxton, and maybe not even Braxton. So he may be the only guy, returning. Who knows? Especially by midseason on, he has a lot to gain by this scheme and by the coaches, in my opinion. I just think he's going to be put in better situations, and that, to me, in of itself, is going to allow him to play his best football. So I would be surprised if he doesn't have the best year of his career so far. and he doesn't keep trending up, based on what we've seen the last 2 years of Ben Johnson and also the Dan Rauscher piece, and also hopefully having a stable right guard if Jonah Jackson can stay healthy. So we'll see.
Well, I love to hear that answer. Ron, Sonny, do you guys have anything else you want to ask or add before we close this thing up?
No, just thank you, Brandon, for coming on. It was an absolute pleasure, getting a chance to kind of pick at your brain a little bit.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, guys. I could talk offensive line anytime, so I appreciate it.
Yeah, and I do want to make a quick shout out to two people who helped us formulate our questions, Jeff Burkus and Mason West. I reached out to those guys, asked if there was anything, and they gave us a few of these. So shout out to them. And Brandon, one more time, can you tell everyone where they can find your work, where they should sign up for it to make sure they don't miss your great content?
Sure. Yeah. So trenchwarfare.substack.com. People can subscribe to my work there. And then establishtheRun.com for offensive line rankings, defensive line rankings. Bleacher Report, if anybody wants any college information for the 2026 draft. I'm starting to scout guys now. So those would be the spots.
Getting after the scouting early. I love it. Well, Ron, Sonny, why don't we get out of here the only way we know how, with a good old-fashioned bear down?
Bear down, baby.
Bear down, gents.
Thank you guys for watching and listening, and we will see you guys next time.